So with an extremely bad flu going around, mirroring the symptoms of the Omicron variant, I'm told, how can you tell the difference? Well, let me just say this. It's best to get tested to be on the safe side. But we have Dr. Alfred Dawes on the line to break down everything for us. My good friend, good to see you. Happy New Year, sir. Hope all is well with you and the family.
Happy New Year to you too and the family, and Simone, same to you.
Hi, Doc.
Yeah, man,
Morning.
thanks. Is this variant the first one that mirrors flu?
Well, the milder cases of the other strains would have had a similar effect because COVID really has different phases, and if it's primarily involved with the upper respiratory tract, the nose and the pharynx, right at the back of the throat, then you would have mostly the running nose and the headaches, the joint pain, well, not really joint pain, so muscle aches and the fatigue that you would get with the flu. But if it progresses to the more severe forms of what we call the pulmonary phase or with lung involvement, that is when you would have the shortness of breath and require oxygen. So the answer is yes. If you have a mild form of any of the coronavirus strain infections, then you would have a disease that shows symptoms almost exactly like the flu, which is why a lot of the naysayers were saying this is nothing more than a flu. But the problem is progression to the lung phase. That is the problem.
So, Doc, is there really a bad flu going around? Is there a bad flu, or is it really
There
corona?
is a bad flu.
There
Yes,
is a
there
bad
is a
flu.
bad flu. We have people who they're showing all the symptoms of the flu and or Omicron, and at the same time, when you do the PCR test, which is very sensitive, it's coming back negative. So we do know that there is a flu going around, and it is showing almost the exact type of symptoms as what we suspect is Omicron, because it's still not confirmed yet. But with the classic symptoms, the sneezing and the upper respiratory airway symptoms, it's highly likely that it is Omicron that is here, that's spreading like wildfire.
Hold on. So you're saying, so it might not be the bad flu that everybody have. It might be Omicron.
As a matter of fact, the majority of people who come in to test and say that their sinuses are acting up or their allergies or they just have the flu or they may not have any symptoms at all and everybody else at the house is sick and they're the only one, so they just want to make sure they're coming back positive. So do not simply say that it is your sinuses acting up, your allergies, or it's just the flu. Go get tested, because you may be having a milder form of it, but then you expose others who have predisposing conditions that will lead them to have the more severe forms, and you don't want to be responsible for passing on what is a mild disease to you to someone else where it can be fatal.
Yeah, this bad flu, it's worse than we normally see during flu season?
Not necessarily. Flu viruses, they again affect persons in different ways. If you don't have any pre-existing conditions, the elderly and so on, and persons with chronic non-communicable diseases, they tend to be worse off with the flu. And that is why we give the flu vaccines every year to persons who have a higher risk of getting hospitalized because of the flu. And it is that same category of persons who have a higher rate of hospitalization with COVID.
Yeah, the narrative, Doc, I think so far has been that this is a milder version of corona. It's not really anything to worry about. And I've heard many doctors warning against that kind of mindset, particularly because of what you just said with the folks who have underlying conditions or the progression. Are we kind of giving Omicron the weight it deserves in terms of seriousness? Or are we you find people kind of saying, well, it's flu, it feel like flu, so let me just stay home and ride it out?
Well, the problem is that over the last 2 years, we have just become so polarized with extremist views as to how we ought to be dealing with this situation. And we have never really looked at finding a middle ground. There is no doubt at all, it is incontrovertible that Omicron is much milder than the other strains that preceded it. If you look at the evidence in South Africa, if you look at the evidence in the UK and Britain, even here so far, when we had hospitalizations and deaths skyrocketing, at some point we had over 20 people dying per day when the daily rates never touched 1,000. We're at 1,500 per day now, and we're not seeing anything close to those levels. Yes, you may say that it will lag by 2 weeks, but the reason why it's lagging by 2 weeks is because we're not doing early treatment. And that is where we ought to be shifting focus at this point in time. As I'd mentioned before, COVID has clearly defined phases. And if you are going to just look at it to say that the majority of persons stay in the first phase, then you're going to say that it is a mild disease and we can continue as usual and we ought to even reopen the entertainment industry and relax measures even more to allow it to spread. On the other hand, if you're going to look at it to say that if enough people get infected in a low vaccination country, then you're going to have more people progressing to the later stages where you have lung involvement and will require oxygen therapy and admission to hospital, especially the ICU, then you're going to say this is a dangerous disease and we ought to lock down and impose drastic measures to curb its spread.
But much milder comparatively doesn't mean that it's still not cause for concern, right?
Exactly. And that is why we ought to be shifting focus now to identification of those who are more likely to progress to the more serious stages, as well as to find ways to identify those who are progressing. And the good thing is that with all of the research that is coming out, we know exactly who are more likely to progress to the more dangerous stages.
Yeah.
And we know exactly how we can screen so that we can pick up progression at an early phase so that we can implement steroids, which are known to work very well, as well as early oxygen therapy that will decrease the number of persons progressing to the severe phase where they may need hospitalization and ICU care. If we use a simple device called a pulse oximeter, it can pick up your low blood oxygen levels before you start to feel short of breath. And then when you initiate therapy at that time, then you will have a dramatic improvement in outcomes. But we're just not talking about that. We're either talking about lockdowns because it can progress to a severe disease, or we're saying do not lock down and free up the place because it is just milder. It is just another flu.
Yeah.
And we ought to get rid of that thinking, because either way we are going to damage the economy and people's lives, or we're going to lose countless lives unnecessarily. We need to shift focus now.
So you're saying we shouldn't be talking about vaccination still?
We, of course, vaccinations are always one of the greatest ways we can decrease the chances of hospitalizations and deaths.
Well, we need to expand the conversation, you're saying.
We need to expand the conversation. And even if everybody in Jamaica got their first shot now, by the time you expect the wave to peak in 2 weeks, we would still not be offered the protection of the vaccines that we would have required. To be protected in this wave, we ought to have been vaccinated at least 2 to 3 weeks ago to offer some amount of protection with a first dose, or have had our second dose 2 weeks ago.
Yep.
So the vaccine is not necessarily what is going to help save us now as a people. It's going to save us from the next wave, whatever it is, if it's the Delta Cron or whatever the mutation comes. But what is going to save us now is an approach where we allow some amount of freedom, and at the same time, again, we identify and protect the vulnerable and screen for persons who are progressing to severe disease and intervene so as to decrease hospitalizations. It has worked in other countries. Our neighbors in Honduras, they have done very well. There are stories about India where they had their kits, and countries in states that had the kits for early treatment, they saw a rapid decline, more so than other states that had no such program in place. The early kits work, identification and prevention works. We use it for cancer, where we screen to find cancer in early stages so that the treatments work better. Why aren't we doing it for COVID?
Yep. Dr. Dawes, there's an article, and I'm certain you'll correct me if I didn't get it right, but I think you suggested that Omicron could bring about herd immunity. Those are my words. Is that close to what you said?
It is the closest we can get to herd immunity, because When you look at the types of vaccines that we have used in the past, such as polio, these are live viruses that are severely weak, so they don't cause an infection. Omicron is a much milder strain than the other coronaviruses that we have had with the Delta wave and the Alpha waves. Now, the good thing about Omicron is that it produces antibodies that work against Delta, which is the opposite. The Delta antibodies did not offer or do not offer any protection against Omicron. The vaccination status of a person does not say whether or not they will get Omicron, which means that Omicron infects everybody, irrespective of their vaccination status or whether they had the other strains before. But the studies coming out of South Africa now are showing that when you have Omicron, you have protection against Delta and the other strains. So it is almost as if you have unleashed a natural vaccine on the population. It's spreading rapidly, and you can get to a peak early, and the majority of the population, because they're going to be infected by this virus, we can't hide from it. It's likely that many persons here who are watching will get infected. They will get some immunity that will offer some protection against strains to come. The idea that we don't lock down, I support it, because if you're going to allow any strain to run through Jamaica with its low vaccine take-up, then this ought to be the one. And if we can identify and protect the vulnerable, we can decrease the death rates and at the same time get as close as we can to herd immunity.
Well, friend, we have to go. News coming up. Always great to see you. Stay safe and excellently explained as always. God bless you and the family. All right?
Thank you, you too.
Medical Director at the Windsor Wellness Center, Dr. Alfred Dawes. More to come on Smile, but first, the second edition of News in 5 right now.